Okay, we are in the gut punch section of Paul. In the letter to the Ephesians, there is a ton that we could talk about tonight. We're just going to get through as much as possible. And like last week, we're going to kind of just see where we go as a group. I have a couple of tangents queued up and ready. Some of them we'll go to if we drive there, and some of them we may not go to at all. So this is the perfect night that if you have questions, or if there's one thing that's not settling well with you, bring it up and we can kind of go down that road together. Because again, we could spend 3 hours on this section, and I don't think y'all want to be here for 3 hours. So just to kind of put us in the letter where we're going to be, I want to bring back up this chart from the notes from Tim Mackey, just again to realign ourselves with what Paul is doing and what we're about to go through. Over the past few weeks, we've been looking at chapters 1 through 3. And as we saw, it really had this beautiful chiastic structure. And anytime you have a chiasm, it is driving you to the center. The center is like the money spot. This is where the gold is. And the center of chapters 1 through 3, as we've been talking about, is this creation of a new messianic temple in God's people. We are this new temple, this new creation. Today, Paul's going to really hammer it in as the new humanity. And now that he's set up that idea and really driven home what it means to be this new temple, what he's going to shift to is how does that actually happen, right? What does our life look like if we are going to be the new humanity? And he's going to get really practical. Sentences get shorter, but somehow still more difficult to understand. And it's really all linked with this therefore. Again, this is who you are, this new temple. Therefore, this is how you're going to live. And from now until the end of the book, there's really 4 sections. And again, it's kind of like a little chiasm, with the middle sections being 3 different ways to talk about the same idea. It's like that diamond mentality of we're going to look at the same thing from 3 different angles to paint a fuller portrait of what it means to be the new humanity. At first, we're going to talk about it in lens of the old versus new humanity, then darkness versus light, and then finally foolish versus wise. So each time he's going to contrast what this old format looks like, the darkness, the foolish, and then he's going to show and paint a picture of what life could be for us. And as we go through that, this is the thing to keep in mind. Paul is painting the picture, a vision of a reality that's not true. It's the vision of a reality that could be, but is not quite yet true. And what he's saying is this is who you've been called to be as these new creations, this new humanity, and basically inviting you to participate. So that's kind of what's going on in this section that we're about to dive into, really all the way through the end of the book. Before we get started, any questions, chapters 1 through 3, any questions setting up where we're about to go? Everybody feeling pretty good?
Yeah.
One more point of just, we've been kind of nailing this home every time we talk about Ephesians, but particularly for this section, it's really important to remember all of the yous are what?
Y'alls.
Y'alls. Y'alls. When we read this, you probably had a similar reaction that I did, most if you're human, which is parts of this are going to feel like a gut punch. Parts of it are going to feel like Paul has your mail and he's talking directly to you. And that's probably true. If you get that nudge, it may be something that we need to listen to, right? But more than anything, Paul is talking to y'all. He's talking to all of us as a community. And it is a mistake for us to read this and only be thinking about us as an individual instead of us as the community. And I think that'll make sense as we start to go through it. Okay, so here's how he begins this section. Remember, there's the big linking word, therefore, in light of everything we just got finished talking about. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Now, this walk word is going to show up over and over and over again. And I think what Paul wants us to have in our minds is a picture of continuous, active action. A lot of us, well, I'm projecting. I'm willing to bet that many of us grew up in a context where Christianity was a one-time decision, one prayer you prayed, and then you kind of got on with it, and you came to church, you're faithful. That's really it. It's that one-time decision, and that's really it. What Paul needs you to see is that following Jesus is not a one-time decision. It's walking. It is walking, continuous, active action. Does that make sense? This is something that you are going to wake up and do every single moment of the day. And that theme is going to come back over and over and over again. Then he gives us a list of qualities in green here. I'm going to read them out, and I want you to tell me what they all have in common. If you've read the email, you'll already know the answer to this. So he says, here's what that looks like. To walk in a manner worthy of the calling is this: humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love. That means carrying each other. Bearing is caring. So we carry one another when life gets hard. Unity and peace. What do all of those things have in common?
The Spirit.
Yeah. What else? Are these things that you can do alone? Humility, gentleness, patience. What do
Only
these
with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, but what do these things require?
Other people.
Other
Relationships.
people, relationships.
Yeah.
Again, not about the you. This is about the y'all. Everything that he's going to talk about here, it is how we relate to one another. This is about how the community, this new temple, this new humanity lives together. It's like the rules of engagement for this new community. Remember, what does Jesus say? All the law is summed up in this: love your neighbor as yourself. It's love God and love other people. Love God, love other people. How do we love God? How do we walk in a manner worthy of that? We love other people, and this is what that looks like. Then he goes into this series of ones: one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. You probably counted these, I hope, when you see repeated, repeated, repeated. And Paul is a good Jew, so there are 7 ones. And if we know anything, there are 2 numbers in Jewish, well, really 3. There are 3 numbers in Jewish writing that you just need to know. They're symbolic to it every time you see them. 7 is one of those. 7 is the number that means completeness or wholeness. The other number we'll talk about in a little bit is 3, so I won't spoil that one just yet. 3 is a big number. And then 40. 40, anytime you see 40 in the biblical text, particularly in the Old Testament, but also in the New, 40 represents a journey, as much time as it needs to take. It can also represent a generation or a test, but 40 is this idea of as long as it takes. So if it says 40, really it's a way of saying it took some time. Does that make sense? 7 is completeness or wholeness. 3 we'll talk about in a minute. 40, this idea of it takes as long as it takes. Why is he in particular going after 7 right here? If it means wholeness, then what is this pointing to?
That's all you need.
This is what we need. If this is how we love each other, and this is all the ones, these have to, in my mind, if this is how we love others, what is this one looking like? Look at the things: spirit, hope, Lord, faith, baptism, God and Father. These all have a little bit of a God kind of flavor to them, don't they? You know what I see here? Love others, love God. 7 ones. Can you think of a prayer in the Old Testament that was really, really central to the Jewish faith that had a lot of one language to it? Here's a hint. It's from Deuteronomy 3.
Shema?
Hear, O Israel, the Lord
Yeah.
our God, the Lord is one.
One.
You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is the closest thing that the Jewish religion had to a creed. And it was radical for the day because it's saying the Lord is our God, Yahweh, and he's one, not a bunch of Roman gods or a bunch of Greek gods or a bunch of Babylonian gods. He is one. This is the prayer they would pray when they woke up, when they went to bed. And it's all about loving God. And what I see Paul doing here is what's often been called the Jesus Creed, which is the Shema plus something to do with loving others. I see that taking shape. Loving others, right? This is how we live and do community. And again, this is the God we're serving. One God expressed in all of these different facets. That's what brings this community to wholeness. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So now Paul is going to talk about kind of what happens as a result. And he uses this language of grace. And remember, we talked about grace last week. Grace, the words for that means gift. So I'm going to change the language just slightly because it's driving to a point here in verse 11. But gifts, this gift was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Okay, so the question you should be asking now, one of them, is what was Christ's gift to us? And so he's going to answer that question. And he's going to answer it with a poem that comes from Psalm 68. And anytime you see a citation like that, it's probably just good practice to go read it. You may not want to, you may not have time. Just go like peek through whatever it is that he's quoting. The psalm that he is quoting, Psalm 68, is a victory psalm. It's associated with the Messiah and it's associated with the Exodus story. There's all kinds of language, chariots, being on the mountain, aka Mount Sinai. It's about when God overthrew the Egyptians, brought his people out into the wilderness. And then we get this language here in verse 18, which is what Paul's quoting. You ascended on high. So there's this victorious figure that went up onto the mountain, leading a host of captives in your train. Who are the captives in the Exodus story?
The Israelites.
Yeah, they're being set free. When this figure goes up on the mountaintop, being trailed by these captives that are being set free, receiving gifts, even among the rebellious, that the Lord is going to dwell with them. What does this sound like to you? Does it remind you of the Exodus story?
Mm-hmm.
What piece of it? Think about, where were they on a mountain?
Mount Sinai.
Yeah, and who went up the mountain?
Moses.
Moses?
That's
Yes.
right. This is what Paul has in mind, the Exodus story, when one of God's prophets and teachers, this historic figure, goes up on the mountain, leading the host of captives, and through the actions that happen up on that mountain, aka the law, God is going to come and dwell with his people. And in this moment, it's tied to the idea of salvation and deliverance. Look what it says in verse 20. Our God is a God of salvation, and to God the Lord belong deliverances from death. God will strike the heads of his enemies. Somehow, through this process of being up on the mountain, right, and God dwelling with his people, there's this idea wrapped up with it of salvation, deliverance from death, and God's ultimate defeat of his enemies. This is key. Now, with all of that in our mind, we're going to go right back to Paul and try and see if we can figure out what Paul is doing here. He's quoting this part, when he ascended on high, leading this host of captives, giving gifts to men. And then he's going to qualify it. In saying he ascended, it's like he kind of takes us aside. What does it mean? But that he also descended into the lower regions of the earth. Okay, what's going on here? Can you think of a time in Paul's mind when a prophet and a great teacher of God, a new Moses-like figure, went up onto a mountain in order to free a whole bunch of captives from death? And in doing so, the means by which he did that, he ascended the mountain, was actually to descend, aka into death. Is that sounding familiar?
I guess he's referring to Jesus, right?
Exactly. What he's saying is this moment of victory, this new Exodus story where God's going to once again deliver his people from death and defeat his enemies, actually happens when Jesus ascended the mountain. Many of you know this, but Jerusalem is actually up on top of the mountain where Jesus was crucified, is up on top of the mountain all throughout the biblical story. I mean, you could do a whole day's study, multiple days, on just mountaintop experiences. Jesus was crucified up on the mountain. That's why it's saying when he ascended on high, both high, lifted up, exalted on the cross, but also up on the mountain. And then at the same time he ascended on the cross, he actually descended into this has been taken by some folks over the years to be this controversial way of believing Jesus actually went down into hell and had to experience I think this is a Catholic belief, if I'm getting that right. I may be wrong. But there are some who believe that Jesus had to actually descend into hell, experience purgatory, and then was able to rise up during the resurrection. It's not saying anything about hell. All it's saying is he went into the earth. It is a idiomatic way of just talking about death. It is through Jesus's ascension on the cross and death that he was able to bring salvation to all people, that he was able to be victorious and defeat the enemies of God. Is this making sense? You see what Paul is doing here? It's very clever. He is banking on people understanding these images that would have been really familiar with him. This is the new Exodus story. He is comparing Jesus to a new Moses figure. This will sound familiar if you studied Matthew with us a couple years ago. This is what it means. This is Christ's gift to us. Christ's gift to us was his ascension on the cross, which is what brings salvation and hope to us. It's through his death that he is actually able to defeat our enemy. This goes right back to Genesis 3. We're not going to go there. I'm going to try and control my tangents off into other places in scripture, but you could go back to Genesis 3 and look at what God says to the snake, right? He will crush your head, but you will bruise his heel. It's that mutual destruction. I told you I wasn't going to tangent, and I basically just gave it to you anyway. Okay, we're going to keep going. Yeah.
Okay, a quick one. Can you roll back to the
Yes.
poem? Okay, so is Paul? I mean, I guess I don't think of Psalms as being prophetic Old Testament literature, but is that what he's trying to do, to say this is the fulfillment of something, or is it not? That's not what he's doing.
I think he's using this image and this idea that's really, this is one place to see it. It's all throughout the Old Testament. This idea that there would be the Messiah, right? Take Jesus out of it for a second. What Paul is saying is the Messiah that you have been hoping for, right? The one who is going to ultimately bring salvation, the new Moses figure. He's saying that one that you've been waiting for, it's Jesus. And that's why he puts the sentence about Jesus's death, which is the surprising piece of the cross. No one expected the Messiah to die in Paul's day. That was what was so ridiculous. It's why that's not quoted in the Psalm, right? He has to kind of add that as you didn't expect this, but it's actually through his death that he ascended.
Okay.
So he's playing on that imagery to make a point. But this would have been an idea they associated with the Messiah, this new Moses-like figure.
And
But-
the point is trying to just say that his death and ascension was the gift. That's the point of
Yes.
going, okay.
His gift was him dying for us to defeat enemies once and for all and bring salvation to all
Okay.
people. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Bill?
Paul knew this because he was a student of the Old Testament.
Yes.
But the Gentiles did not know this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like he's speaking to the Jews here.
Now, keep in mind, we are at a point in church history where the two are converging into one.
Right, understand.
And Paul has spent 2 years with the Ephesians. And in a moment, we're going to have evidence. What does he say? I forget what verse it is, but he'll say in a minute, that is not the way you learned. I think he's absolutely spent a ton of time coaching them up in the Old Testament. And this may not be as unfamiliar to them at this point as it is sometimes for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I understand.
Yeah. And I think he's explaining it as he goes too. Okay, ready to move on? We're feeling good about this? So in light of that, in light of Christ's gift to us, Paul is going to say, by the way, he also gave gifts to us in a different way. This verse 11, this gave, is linked up right here to this gave, right? So when I say gifts, grace was given to each of us here in his death and resurrection, and gifts are given to us right here. These next couple of verses are typically linked with what we call the spiritual gifts. How many are familiar with the idea of spiritual gifts? This is one of my soapbox things. Now you're probably thinking everything is a soapbox thing, and you would be correct. This is one that really gets me going. So this is one we're going to tangent on for a moment. There are 5 places, a handful, where Paul in the New Testament talks about spiritual gifts. This is one of them. Here's the list we're working with, okay? He gives the apostles, the prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. 5 different things. Now, I've got here a list of some of the other places where Paul talks about spiritual gifts. And here's another one. Prophesying, spiritual gift, faith, serving, teaching, encouragement, generosity, leading, mercy. Those are spiritual gifts. Okay. Here's 1 Peter 4. Serving, speaking, aka teaching, right? 1 Corinthians 12. This one's a famous one. Spirit of message of wisdom, message of knowledge, another faith by the Spirit, gifts of healing, miraculous powers, prophecy, distinguishing between spirits, discernment, different kinds of tongues and the interpretation of tongues. Okay, here's another one. God has placed in the church apostles, prophets, teachers, miracles, healing, helping, guidance, all different kinds of tongues. These are the passages that are commonly associated with the spiritual gifts. What do you notice about all of those passages? Are they talking about the same things? Or is each list different?
Different.
They're pretty different. They're pretty different. And yet, what we have done in Christian circles, because we love processes and assessments and being able to quantify and analysis everything to death, is we've created spiritual gift assessments that boil them down to like a handful of gifts as if those are the only gifts available. But what we clearly see every time Paul talks about spiritual gifts is he's just giving you examples of the kinds of things that can be gifts. Does that make sense? If there were only like 8 gifts, he would have used the same list every single time, and he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He uses gifts like, it's like this, and it's kind of like this. Every single time, it's different. It's like he tailors them for the particular mission at hand. And why this is important is because you should never take another spiritual gift assessment ever again. I mean, seriously, they should be destroyed, because what they do is they limit us in our thinking. What Paul is saying here is that there are all these gifts and talents that are given to the church to be able to serve the body. So look at what he's saying here in Ephesians 4. He gave all of these different kinds of gifts: apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. What are all of these things? These are all positions of leadership in the church and in the community, right? So Paul is saying all of these kind of like professional Christians, you could say, the ones who are leading in this new temple community, what's their job? What is their job? Look at verse 12. To equip the saints for the work of ministry. All of us that like work in ministry, right? Whether you're a teacher, whether you're on paid church staff, or you're someone who just has a gift of bringing others to Christ, or you are a shepherd in a way that's not like a traditional shepherd. By the way, this is just pastor. Lots of you are pastors, but wouldn't call yourself a pastor. Teachers, if you've ever led a Bible study, all of these gifts are given with the intent to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Who are the saints?
Believers.
Everybody. If you are a follower of Jesus, you are among the saints. And so the whole job of all of those who teach, who preach, who pastor, who are prophetic in who bring other people to Christ, their whole job is to equip everyone else to do the work of ministry. This is so important to me, because we have fallen into a culture that puts a lot of distance between church staff and the congregation. Oh, we'll bring them to you, pastor, and you do the work of ministry. You're the ministers. You're the ones who are doing ministry. We're just going to be here. We'll bring people to you, right? That's the model we've moved into as a capital C church. And what Paul is saying is nothing could be further from the truth. All these people who lead in church environments in a variety of ways, some of you are among that group. Your whole job is to equip everybody else to be right there beside you. The ones who are actually doing the work of ministry in Paul's eyes are the saints, the whole body of Christ. And so if you somehow think that going to church or just being a follower of Jesus is like a passive thing, this is Paul saying, you have a job to do. And that job is to use the gifts that you have been given for the glory of God, for the work of ministry. And I think that this is so important, because when we take these spiritual gifts assessments that limit it down to like these and a couple others based on his other places, what we do is we force people to look at this list and go, well, maybe I'm a teacher, maybe I'm an evangelist, but I don't know. I don't really identify with any of those. And actually, I'm going to show you my favorite definition of spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts are any talent, skill, or ability that you have that is empowered by the Spirit and can be useful for the church and ministry. My seminary professor drilled this into us. His name is Gary Brashears, and he would tell a story of meeting a janitor in a church. And the janitor is, just the happiest person in the building. Why? Because he is using his gift for the service of God. Every single one of us has spiritual gifts, and the way that we use those gifts, or what gifts they are completely unique to each of us. The unique combination of skills and talents and passions that God has given you is how he wants you to do the work of ministry. Is this making sense? You all have a job to do. You are the ministers. And part of my role, I consider myself to be a teacher. Part of my role is to equip you to go out and do the work of ministry. If you think that the future of the church rests in the hands of its leaders, you are missing the point. The future of the church rests in the hands of the saints who are doing the work of ministry using the spiritual gifts that they have been given. And it's not enough to think of the spiritual gifts as a finite list of like 8 things, because any talent that you have, any gift that you have, any skill or particular passion that you have, if it can be used to the glory of God, it is a spiritual gift. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Alex,
Yeah.
several months ago, in the sanctuary, Paul Rasmussen was preaching, of course, and one of his sermon bites was, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you are in full-time ministry. And that's just something that just really resonated me. Isn't that beautiful? If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you are in full-time ministry.
Yeah, that's exactly what Paul is saying here. All of us have a job to do, and Christ, through his sacrifice, his gift to us, he has also given us the ability to do that work in a variety of ways. We are all part of this new temple community, but the way that we do that is unique to each of us. Now, at the same time, all of us have a unique goal within that framework. So Paul is going to say, all of this is happening so that we can equip the saints for ministry, so we can build up the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of stature of the fullness of Christ. This is all Paul's fancy talk way of saying that the goal of the way that we walk with Christ, use our spiritual gifts, the way that we do ministry, is so that we can become the fullness of Christ, aka become like Jesus. Second tangent of the night. This is a new book. It just came out. I would love for our whole church to read this book. I actually just gave copies to Matt, to Paul, and a couple other people, my whole team. It's called Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. And his view of discipleship is absolutely amazing. He talks about this: to follow Jesus is to become his apprentice. This is what discipleship means. It means this active, continuous thing that we are learning from Jesus. Our goal is to become like him. And so we organize our life around 3 driving goals: be with Jesus, become like him, do as he did. This is what Paul is talking about. Our goal is to become like Jesus. The way that we do that is through John Mark Comer, these 3 things: be with Jesus, that way become like him, and we're able to do the kinds of things that he did. I also love his quote. This whole book I have highlighted that I've gotten through. Here's another quote that really just stuck out to me. For Jesus, salvation is less about getting you into heaven and more about getting heaven into you. This is what Paul is talking about. Look at all the things we've talked about so far in this chapter. It all has to do with right here, right now, how we're living with our community. Even when he points to the sacrifice of Jesus that brings us salvation, what is he then talking about? Okay, now go do the work of ministry. Paul is way more concerned with the here and now and how we're living and following Jesus, how we're calling others to follow Jesus in our unique ways that we've been gifted, so we can become like him as a community. Make sense? And this is huge, 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 huge. If your goal as a Christian is not to become like Christ, you are missing out on the fullness of what God has for you. And Paul's going to say, by doing this, this is how we're no longer children. It's how we're not tossed to and fro by all these different competing winds of the day, these winds of doctrine, these ways of thinking, human cunning, craft. This is the powers at work. If we don't want to be swept away by the powers at work in the world, if you remember our discussion from week 1, then we have to be made into the image of Christ. Rather, he says, speaking the truth in love, this is another way to say what we've been saying, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. We are to grow up into the one who is the head, aka Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to set the stage for what's to come. I want to talk about this word head. It's not going to matter to you right now, but on Monday, it's going to matter to you. And I want to set the stage now so that when you read it on Monday, you can read it through a different lens. When you hear Christ as the head, what does that word head mean to you?
Top.
Top? Say more about that. What does it mean to be at the top?
Means it's where your brain is. I mean, it's the top of the food chain.
Yeah. Yeah. If the CEO is the top of the food chain, what does he have over his company?
Power.
Power, authority, and power. In our Western mind, this word head is absolutely 100% associated with power and authority. And therefore, on Monday, when we read those famous words, wives, submit to your husband because he's the head, what do we think it means? Right? I mean, you don't even have to say it out loud. You know what I'm getting at. What this is not saying, the Hebrew word for head, or Greek word for head here is kephale. And nowhere in Paul's writing does it have the connotation of authority. Here's one of the ways that we know that is true. Let me see, where are we at here with, okay, here's an example. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, we're okay with all of this until we get to this last sentence. Because, by the way, saying that God is the authority and power over Christ is a heresy. That was like proven wrong in church history. And so if this can't be true, for it to mean power and authority over, these can't be true. You see what I'm getting at? It's got to mean something else. So what does it mean? It doesn't mean power or authority. Nowhere in Paul's writing. Somewhere in my tabs, there's another example of this we'll find here in a minute. Most often, what this word means, by the way, there were words that meant power and authority that Paul could choose, but he doesn't. He chooses kephale. And often what kephale means is source, like the source of a river. We are to grow up into every way him who is our very source of being, Christ. We go back to look at, oh, here it is. This is Colossians 1. He is the head of the body, the church. What does it mean for him to be the head of the body? He is the beginning, not the power and authority. He is the very first, the beginning of all. What Paul is doing is drawing on that creation idea of what came first, what is the source of being. And when it says that about Christ, it's Christ came as a gift from the Father, not that it was one like a power dynamic or struggle, but it's an idea of source or beginning. Now, again, you probably don't care too much about that now. It doesn't have a lot to do with this piece of the puzzle. It will on Monday, and we'll talk more about it. Questions on that? Thoughts, comments?
Alex, I heard something at St. Andrew that was a little bit different about, wives and husbands. What we learned is that telling wives to obey was just sort of like, tell me something new. But to tell husbands that they had to love their wives just caused an uproar. I mean, it'd be like shutting down the NFL season, because they viewed their wives as purely property. And then Paul was telling them to elevate them. Probably not what we want, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Wait until next week. We're going to get into all of that in great detail.
Okay.
I've been working on that this week, and it's what Paul is doing in those passages, the submission passages, is unbelievable. And we don't give him we give him the opposite credit we should be giving him. Instead of him being backwards and like out of touch with reality, he is being the most progressive he could be for his day and age. And we
Right.
completely flip that on its head. But it starts right here with, we have to stop thinking that just because a word means something to us in our current culture, that that's exactly what it meant in Paul's culture. This is not about power and authority. This is about beginning and source. And that's a huge difference, huge difference. Here's where we see that unique piece come into play. When each part, each unique person within the New Temple community, with all their unique gifts, skills, and talents, when that's working properly, the whole body grows and it builds itself up in love. That's what the picture of this new community looks like. Now he's going to get into this second way of looking at this, or really the first way of kind of breaking this down, this new humanity idea. Now I say and testify to the Lord that you must no longer walk, there goes that walk word again, as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They're darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God. Do you see he's giving this whole picture of what it looks like? You were this, right? Now I'm going to call you to be this. Don't walk, don't live, don't be active in this way of doing things, right? N.T. Wright talks about the futility of their minds being, it's a way of saying it's going nowhere. It's not really going to lead you anywhere. It's not doing anything for you. And all of this is due to their hardness of heart. What Paul is going to talk about, what he talked about last week, is the idea that we need new hearts, right? In Jesus, we get this new heart, this new spirit. And with that, we have a new way to live. We talked all about that last week. Here's that famous verse. That's not the way you learned. In other words, that's the old way of doing things. Futile, leads to death, hard hearts. You've got new hearts. Here's what that means. Take off your old self and put on a new self. That language, put off, put on, is likely a way of hearkening back to the idea of baptism, because when you were baptized, you would take off your old clothes, put on a new white robe, be immersed into the waters, and come out new. So what he's talking about is live into your new baptism. When you were baptized, you were called into this new creation, this new way of life. And so now be renewed in the spirit of your minds. He's talking about the difference between futile ways of thinking and the renewed way of thinking. In other words, does what we think about the world really matter? Yeah, the stories we tell ourselves about this world that we live in, how we view ourselves in it, and how we view our role in the world is a huge, huge thing. And again, he wants it to be in the image of God. We've got to renew our mind into the image of Christ. The short way of looking at this, and again, John Mark Comer talks about it in his book and in his theory of change, we have to rewrite the stories of our brain. It's why teaching and sermons and Bible study are so important. Research shows that in the first years of becoming Christian, Bible study is the number one thing that drives change. Why? Because you got to rewrite the brain. We have to rewrite our patterns of thinking. But that can only take us so far, which is why Paul is going to keep talking about the way that we walk. Because after Bible study, you're going to hit a ledge where you've rewritten the way that your brain thinks, and now it has to get into your heart. And the way that you get it into your heart is to actually change the way that you live, your habits and the way that you practice and the way that you live in community. And so what do you know? That's what he's going to say next. Therefore, here's how you live in community. All of these things in yellow, all of the things he's talking about, again, just like before, are ways that we live with one another. Speak truth with your neighbor. Don't sin when you're angry. Don't steal from people. Don't talk rotten, as Matt talked about it in his sermon. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger be put away from you. Matt did an incredible job on Sunday with this particular paragraph. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. The two things I want to highlight that he talked about is it's not enough the best example is this thief one. It's not enough to just say, I'm not going to steal. What does Paul call us to? Actually do honest work. Don't just take from the community. You need to contribute. And it's this way of saying it's not enough to just not do bad things. God has so much more for us. He actually has a way that we are called to live. Does that make sense? Again, go watch Matt's sermon. This was a really, really, really good one. Thoughts, questions, comments on this so far?
Alex, this is Norman. I was thinking on the comment of with Jesus being the head of the church, to me, it was kind of tying all back to the tree of good and evil, not to partake of it. And then the examples of, the Gentiles, don't be the futility of your minds. That means
Yeah.
you're the one that's deciding what's good and evil. You're deciding what's best for you. And then he gives all these examples of things where we, in essence, tend to do that, where we tend to be the judge and the jury, and we seem to be all knowing. And then he's like trying to retrain us for his upside down kingdom, and to have us trust in his thinking, trust in his ways, such that we then walk with faith, we walk with trust, and we walk with obedience. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's how I've always followed this portion of it.
Yeah, you're spot on, which leads us right into this next little section here. This is the third way he's going to talk about what it means to follow God, right? We've done it like 3 different times. Again, be imitators of God, be made in the image of God, go back to subscribing to being like Jesus. How do we do that? Well, here's all the things you don't do and the things that you do. He's going to repeat the same 3 kinds of sin over and over and over again. Remember how I told you we would talk about the number 3? In Hebrew, they really didn't have a word for very. And so when they wanted to like emphasize something, they would just repeat it. It's why anytime you read Hebrew poetry, you're going to see the same idea repeated twice. That's a way of saying very. Holy, holy. It's very holy. If you wanted to talk about something being like of the utmost importance, what would you do? Repeat it 3 times. Holy, holy, holy Lord. It's like you are the holiest of holies. Make sense? Anytime you see something in Hebrew literature or in the Bible repeated 3 times, it's like this is the utmost. And so what Paul is going to do in this section is repeat this same idea: sexual morality, impurity, coveting, all these kinds of things 3 different times. And, Tim brings in a couple of quotes talking about all of these things that he's talking about: sexual morality, impurity, covetousness. It's all linked to the idea of idolatry. They're all things that we place in the place that God should have in our lives. And so what is he going to say? This is not even to be named among you. These are out of place. This is not the inheritance of the kingdom. These are no things that should be in this kind of new community. Instead, fill it with thanksgiving. And then I just want to point out this one idea. He goes down here for this third little section, and he breaks the pattern. So it's this is really clear in Tim's class. I'm probably doing a bad job of explaining it, but he's going to give us the thing that's bad, reiterate it shouldn't be among us. Give us the thing that's bad, reiterate it shouldn't be among us. This time he gives us something that should be. Reiterate the thing that's bad, why it shouldn't be among us. And then now he's going to do something a little bit different this third time. He's adding this little refrain in verse 6. Let no one deceive you with empty words, that futility of thinking. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes among the sons of disobedience. Now, I don't know what goes through your mind when you think about the wrath of God. but I have some guesses. My guess is that it's not good thoughts, right? No one thinks positively about the wrath of God. And my hunch is that it takes you to a place of Old Testament wrath of God, right? God smiting people down when they upset him. Can anyone identify with that? I mean, just nod if that's where you at. But what we have to understand is that actually, when we talk about God's wrath, what we are talking about is God just giving over to people to what they want to do. Here's an example of that. This is Romans 1:28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought to be done. God's wrath, more often than not, is not expressed in him smiting people, but in him releasing his protection and allowing people to reap the consequences of the actions that they've committed. This is what the exile was all about. Israel, you don't want to be my people. You don't want me to be your king. You want to go your own way. Okay, here's what happens when you do that. Foreign nation's going to come in and wipe you out. And you'll be taken to another place. God's wrath is not what we often think of as this like angry God, sinner, smash like an ant, right? It is more often like a parent who says, please don't touch the heater. Please don't, do that. Please don't do that. And if you're a parent, what do you know? If they really want to learn the lesson, what are you going to do?
Let them go.
You got to let them do it, right? You just got to let them do it and let them face the consequences. My daughter refuses to put on a coat, even if it's 0 degrees outside. And no matter how many times I say, you're going to be cold, please put on a coat. You're going to be cold. Please put on a coat. What does she do? Go outside without a coat. And so what do I have to do? Fine. I'm going to keep a coat in the car, right? I'm not going to leave her out with no coat, but I'm going to let her experience the consequences of her decision. This is 9 times out of 10, when you read the biblical story closely, this is what God's wrath looks like. Giving people over to the consequences of their own actions. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. This has a lot of implications for how we view hell and how we view the idea of heaven. I think it was Adam Hamilton talked last night about the gates of hell being closed from the inside, right? It's people not wanting to be with God, not God not wanting to be with people. Okay, we're going to keep going because I don't want to spend all our time here. We've got about 7 minutes left and we've still got a long way to go. I'm going to skip down. He talks about the third way here, darkness and light and unfruitful works. There's a whole idea in the email I talk about. What does it mean for us to think about exposing darkness as a community, right? Part of our communal responsibility to one another is to expose darkness. That has a lot of implications for how we live in relationship with other people. What does it look like to allow darkness to be exposed among a community? I think it takes vulnerability, very intense trust and relationship, and done in love. Does that make sense? You being in community with other Christians is not just so you have friends and it feels good. It is so that we are calling each other to be light and exposing the darkness within us. We don't pretend to be something that we're not. We don't put on airs with one another. Church is not a place for perfect people. It is a place where we can feel free to expose the things going on inside of us so that we can be iron sharpening iron, right? Do I want to get into this? He quotes this Isaiah passage. I think I've got it pulled up here in my 1,000 tabs. He's going to quote this passage of Isaiah that is, again, a messianic passage. This is kind of the part where he's really talking about your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise, you who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. If you keep going down, the context of that Paul is quoting here in light of what it means to expose darkness and live in this kind of community and be fruitful, happens in the same context as this passage right here. In the days to come, Jacob shall take root, Israel shall bloom and put forward shoots, and fill the whole world with fruit. Fill the whole world with fruit. This is a messianic passage because it's talking about the day when Jacob, right, who's associated with Jesus, is going to be the kind of Israel that Israel couldn't be for itself, and fill the whole world with the fruit that Israel was supposed to bring but couldn't. And so what is Paul kind of associating this? We're trying to be people who bring the fruit of light, right? And how do we do that? We walk in the Messiah. We have to be connected to the one who's bringing that fruitfulness. So again, he says, look carefully how you walk in that way of life. And this is probably my favorite part of this whole section. I did a video on it for today, so I'm only going to touch on it briefly, but watch that if you want the whole thing. He's saying, again, how you walk, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Fun fact, making the best use of is actually the word for redeem. And again, that goes back to the Exodus story we were talking about earlier. Think of the picture of setting captives free. What Paul wants us to see, he wants us to set our time free. Our habits, the way that we live, the way that we walk, we have to set ourselves free from the things that are holding us captive. We have to redeem our time. We have to really think critically about how much time we spend on TikTok, right? And what that's creating in us, right? Think about where you spend the majority of your time. Is that leading you to be a kind of person who's more like Christ and more able to be the kind of new human that Paul is calling us to be here in this passage? Or is it leading you down the path of foolish, like what he's talking about? I think this is a beautiful, beautiful metaphor, and one that is probably the most important line for our culture today, because we're all too busy, we're all overwhelmed, and what Paul's saying we need to do is set ourselves free, redeem ourselves the way that we're using our time, because he's going to make the case that there are really two things we could fill ourselves with. We can fill ourselves with something like wine. And he's not putting a prohibition on wine here. He's saying when you fill yourself with something like wine, you are no longer in control. I mean, if you've had more than 2 drinks, you know your decisions are not really your own anymore, right? You don't have full, your judgment is a little bit lax. You are allowing something else that doesn't have your best interest at heart to control you in that moment. Now, you can do that. You can fill yourself up with wine. You can fill yourself up with all kinds of things, or you can fill yourself with the Spirit. Fill yourself with the very, the essence of the thing that created you, has your best interest at heart, knows who you are, wants to create you into the image of Christ. Which one are you going to do? We have to liberate our time and fill ourselves up with the Spirit. That is how we can begin to be remade into the image of Christ. Is this making sense? I mean, if there is nothing else you take from this night, never take a spiritual gift assessment and liberate your time. Do a real inventory. Sit down and think about, where am I spending my resources and my time and my money? What am I giving all of that to? Your attention even. And is it the kind of thing that's filling you up within or without of your control? And does it have your best interest at heart? At the very end of this is this famous passage, submitting yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. By the way, grammatically, this sentence And all of these sentences are one. There is no period. In the Greek, if you read this, there is no verb in this sentence. This submit is not here. It's up here. It's this submit. This is the same sentence. And so when we start to look at this on Monday, and we'll really dive into what it means to submit to one another then, because there's a lot of amazing things that are associated with this. What you need to know when you read these passages, this is not a new topic. This is connected, absolutely connected to all of this idea. If we want to be the kind of people who walk in the way of Jesus, then all of this is true, but this is in the same vein. So singing and making melody, giving thanks always, submitting to one another, those are the ways that we are filled with the Spirit. This is like an indentation of that. It is not a whole new thing. Does that make sense? And again, that'll be more clear when we start to talk about what this means. I do want to show you one thing, just because, you're here. And as you read on Monday, I want you to be prepared. What does it mean to submit? What does just that word mean? The Greek word is uptasso. Hupo means under. Tasso means to place or set. And so what it's meaning is to place or set yourself under. So to submit to someone else is to place yourself under them. In other words, not power. It is to think about them as more important than yourself. Norm, you mentioned the whole Genesis 3 idea, the tree, right? This is it. This is it. Instead of thinking of ourselves first and only, that we have the right way of thinking, we're going to consider someone else as more important than ourselves. Paul talks about this idea in Philippians 2. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, count others as more significant than yourself. This idea of submit to one another is not unique to this passage here. And it is not primarily even talking about wives and husbands. Those are some examples he's going to give that were unique for the day. But what starts it all is everyone submitting to everyone. Because when the community works best is when it's not selfishly driven, but we are constantly looking out and placing ourselves under one another. The closest image I can think of for this is when you watch like an old medieval war movie, and they have the shields. And how do the shield systems work? I'm not military, so I'm going to try and explain this, but somebody else probably can do it better. Your shield is not protecting you. It's actually protecting the person next to you, the way that you hold it. And when you form like a phalanx of shields, it only works if every single person is protecting the person beside them. That's submitting to one another. You're not protecting yourself or only thinking about yourself. You're thinking of the person beside you. This is what it means to submit. And what we're being told before we ever get to these other examples, we're all submitting to one another. And that is hugely significant for how we read these next couple of passages. And it's significant because this world that Paul is writing in cares just more than you can know about hierarchy. Slaves and masters and Roman soldiers and governors versus hierarchy is the utmost important. And what Paul's going to do systematically over these next few verses is just throw that hierarchy out of whack. When you step into the new kingdom, when you become part of the new temple, that hierarchy is gone. And you're going to look to the person beside you. It doesn't matter who they are, and submit to one another. Make sense? All right. Thoughts, questions, comments for anything that we've talked about or not talked about for tonight? Anything that's confusing, not sitting well with you? No questions. We've done well, or I have just messed y'all up.
You've done well.
What do y'all think about this? What's standing out to you?
I'm waiting for that wives discussion next week.
Oh, don't you worry. We'll go there.
I just,
Alex, can you go back to verse 7 and 4 in chapter 4?
thank you, Alex.
This one. Right?
Yeah. Okay. So I said, yeah, chapter verse 7. Okay. I get hung up on words that say like, according to the measure, the word measure of Christ's gift. And the NIV, which I'm looking at, says, as Christ apportioned it. Is there like, and you kind of you didn't mention that, but I get hung up on those words thinking we're supposed to figure out what they mean, or are they important? So grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift, or as apportioned. It almost seems like it's being sort of doled out in a measured way. So is that like, I don't know, like,
Yeah.
I get hung up on that.
That's okay. I got hung up on, this is the part of this passage that I got the most hung up on this week. It took me a long time to sort through this. And what I think he's saying is, really, I think there's two options here. One way to view this is grace is given, these spiritual gifts are given to each of us according to the measure of Christ's gifts, the fullness of the gift that Christ gave us. And again, what is the gift? His death and resurrection. So that you can think of like the salvation, the victory that came through his death and resurrection. So according to the full measure of that just immeasurable gift, we've been given individual gifts. I think that's one way to look at it. I also think you could look at it as of saying, we have each been given according to Christ, like his blessing on our lives, different spiritual gifts in the measure of that. So another way of thinking is like, you've been given certain gifts. I've been given certain gifts. Phil's been given certain gifts according to the measure of Christ's gift. In other words, like, and I'm doing a bad job. This is how confusing this verse is. It's just not even easy to explain. According to the measure of what he wants to give us. In other words, Christ has blessed us through his wisdom with different spiritual gifts. I tend to think it's the first view. The measure of Christ's gift is this massive, amazing thing. And we, as the body, have been given a gift that matches that in extravagance. What is that gift? The leaders of the community and the saints that do the work of ministry. That's how I read it. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. It's okay to say it doesn't.
According to measure, it's just like, I don't know.
Because it's not good English for us today. What else? Thoughts, questions?
So Alex, I gotta share, literally your wording is identical to what happened on Monday. We were doing a Bible study on this, and I was leading some discussion and just full of love for all the details you all share and stuff, and going through it and just actually trying to engage others, and it's working pretty well. But then one guy goes, Norman, it just occurs to me that maybe you're overcomplicating things. Doesn't it come down to love God and love people? And you said those very words tonight.
Yes.
Right.
So it is that simple, but yet it is that complex and that exciting too, to go into all the other details. And it was like really complicating, frustrating for me, because it was clear that this gentleman hadn't listened to any of the messages live or recorded. He hadn't listened to any of the videos. He hadn't read the weekly emails. He hadn't even read the text. He didn't even have the book. So to him, it was just a simple concept. Let's just keep this simple. I don't really want to know all the details.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is my form of apologizing for all these times when I have these asides that take you off course.
Oh,
because it was like, I'm sorry, we're here for this Bible study, and this is what we're studying right now.
Well, you said it best. It is so simple, and yet it's so complex. I mean, think about what he is saying. The way that we live, this pattern of our lives, the way we think, the way we act, the way we live in community with one another, that is what helps us become like Christ. And
Yeah.
that's the goal. I mean, simple. If you think about our goal is to become like Jesus, is there anything that's simple about that? Right? But yet it is so, our whole lives, none of this power struggle, none of this political mess, all of these things that we make this gigantic, it's just so much simpler than that. Like you said, our goal is to love God and love others. And Paul is going to be really practical about how he hopes that looks for each of us. And I think there's some challenging things that we have to sit with in, we're not going to go into them too much because I really think in a lot of ways they speak to themselves. But what does it look like to rid ourselves of sexual immorality, to impurity and covetousness? By the way, this is very temple-like language. This is Leviticus language. This is not purity culture like what was taught in evangelical Christianity. So if you read this and you think, oh boy, purity, not the same, go read Leviticus. That has nothing to do with that. I mean, this is the one that hits me. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking. All I watch on TV fits into those categories, right? Simple and complex. And I think that this calls us, I think the image that should be in our minds as we read it this week is, what does it look like to walk in the way? Every single day we are walking, we are going somewhere. Paul has ideas, Jesus has ideas about where we should be going. And we have to decide, is the way that we're walking leading us down the road toward Christ? Or are we walking away from him? And I think that that's a simple question that has very complex consequences.
And I don't want you to miss, in all of that was meant to be a thank you
Oh.
and appreciation for what you all do, because you do bring it to life. You do bring deeper depth to it. You bring it to a personal level as well as a community level, and you challenge us and we grow. And all that stuff is what makes a person see differently, and that's what makes us act differently. And that's, to me, what it takes. So I just thank you. Thank you very, very much for what you all do.
Yeah.
I agree. Thank you.
Well, okay, I'm going to warn you now. Next week is our last week, and it's like the fire week, okay? We talk about everything controversial that we could talk about. Wives, if you watch beside your husband or wife, you may want to watch on separate screen. I'm just kidding. We're going to dive into this passage and put it in its context, and I think we'll see it very differently. We're going to talk about the armor of God. And if you grew up in certain Christian circles, this has a whole context that we need to wrestle with about what it means to wear the armor of God. So next week, we're ending on a mic drop moment. As you read this week and next week, because we're in this part of the story where Paul really is challenging us, I want you to both sit with that challenge, right? Let Paul read your mail. Let him prompt you into thinking about the way that you live. And again, if that's something that interests you, this is it. Like, this is it. If you don't want to buy the book, there's a podcast, just, look on the resources I put for this week in the email. This is something that our church is going to be really big into over the next year and really beyond. What does it mean for us to become like Jesus, to put that as our guiding light and our goal? It's not enough to just, I want to be a good person. Nope. We want to be like Jesus. How we do that is what Paul wants to tell us in this story. Okay. One more week.
Okay.
Who wants to pray for us tonight? Phil, can I call on you to pray for us?
That's where this can be done. Okay. Father, we thank you so much for this Ephesians study and the privilege we have of Alex leading it and shedding new light and wisdom on the scriptures. And we thank you for all the time that she's spent preparing and to educate us and take us further than we would have been just reading it. And Father, I pray for everybody in this group that you'll bless them this week and you'll keep your arms around them and keep them safe. Jesus' name, amen.
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 All right. See y'all
Bye.
next week.
Uh,